Ever feel like the resources and advice out there for women are missing something essential? I thought so too, which is why more than 6 years ago, I created She Said, She Said. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan, and after 3 decades in communications and then advocacy and now juggling motherhood and entrepreneurship, trust me, friend, I get it. Making a real impact takes more than just passion. It takes the right mindset, the right skills, the right investments, and the right community. On this show, we dive deep with incredible women from all walks of life who have been there. We uncover the secrets to building influence, navigating tricky relationships, and staying true to ourselves even when it's tough. And let's face it, it often is. I also throw in my own favorite productivity and life hacks, things that have shifted my perspective and might help you too. Wherever you are in your journey, my goal here is to leave you inspired to define success your way and to help you build the confidence you need to tackle your biggest goals. Subscribe today and let's unlock your full potential, your confidence, and your greatest influence. Hey friend, welcome to the podcast. So here's a question for you to kick us off today. How often do you think about and analyze your triggers? You know, those things that other people do that literally sets us ablaze and sends us into that reactive mode. We might not always show it, but being triggered can set off a cadence of emotion inside of us. And those emotions can then short circuit our most effective leadership abilities. But learning to understand those triggers and maybe, as this week's guest suggests, even sharing them with our colleagues is just one of the insightful takeaways from today's conversation. I am joined by the fabulous Dana Mayor. She is a partner at McKinsey & Company, and she's the author of an insightful new book that is just out this week. It's called The Journey of Leadership: How CEOs Learn to Lead from the Inside Out. Dana and I talk about fear and the loss of control, and then the patterns that are often unleashed when we fail to manage those feelings. We talk about the challenges of leading in an increasingly automated and complex world and the many contradictions that leaders must navigate. You know, be decisive, but open and inclusive. Be professional, but authentic. Be tough, but kind. While Dana's book is not exclusively written for women, her perspective will resonate with you, especially if you've ever felt the pressure to be perfect, who hasn't, or if you've ever struggled to balance authenticity with authority, which I think is a really tough one for women, or maybe if you've struggled to stay relevant in a world that is constantly changing. I think you're going to find a lot of value in today's episode. So friend, let's get to it. Here is episode 301 with my fabulous guest, author and McKinsey & Company partner, Dana Mayor. Enjoy. Dana, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you, and I'm delighted to have you today because it is publication day for your amazing book. Congratulations.
It's the day. Thank you so much. I didn't realize it's going to be such an exciting milestone, but it is.
Oh, it's tremendous. Oh, I'm thrilled for you. And I'm thrilled especially because I really love this book. So I hope that folks will use the show note that we're going to include for the book so that they can purchase it themselves. But let's jump into the conversation and talk about what's required of a CEO that is really different maybe than what was required before.
Yes, and I think our book title does say how CEOs learn to lead from the inside out, but it's really about leadership in general. And of course, the leader of all leaders in a corporate environment is the CEO, but it could be for leaders of non-for-profit organizations, social organizations, or leaders who are growing. And so when I say what I say now, I'm thinking about all of those. But the learnings that we have in the book do come from stories of 500 CEOs and work that we have done. And so to your question, what is required today that was probably not required a couple of decades ago is the ability to stand at that junction of all tensions. Short-term objectives, long-term objectives, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, inflation, socio-demographics that are changing. For the first time ever, 5 different generations in the workforce. Decisions need to be made super quickly. Inflationary environment that many of us, did not grow up in a world where we knew how to manage in that. And so the competing demands and the expectation, particularly post-COVID, of the workforce to lead from a place of purpose, all that is introducing a lot of tension and a lot of uncertainty and the need to respond on the spot, which is quite different from where it was decades ago.
I mean, it's so incredibly complex in a way that, I think past generations would just have been completely mystified by how sort of where we are now. There's so much opportunity and so much promise. And yet, it is really difficult to manage yourself, to manage your team amidst all of these sort of competing demands. Let's maybe talk a little bit about how you found yourself in this work. Maybe talk a little bit about your background and what you do at McKinsey, because this is a product of McKinsey, and you have co-authored this book along with a number of colleagues. So maybe talk a little bit about the process that you went through to get to this book.
Absolutely. Well, look, I did not start here at all. In fact, if you would have asked me when I joined McKinsey, why did you join McKinsey? I thought I am joining so that I can solve the world's most complicated problems with most difficult companies or biggest, largest institutions. And for the first 10 years of my work, given that I come from a tech background, I'm a computer science engineer in my background, that's what I did. And while I was on this journey, I realized that it's very exciting and we can come up with the most beautiful strategies and approaches. But at the end of the day, if we don't excite and engage people in that process, none of that is going to happen. Mm. And if we are committed to the impact, if we want to see a difference, if we want to leave our clients and people that we work with in a place where they're better equipped to continue to navigate the world and realize their dreams, that is just not enough. And so I moved from wanting to only do tech to actually realizing that leadership matters, people matter. And with a mentor who said, no, you do this, I was exposed to culture and change. I then led the culture and change service line. From there, I led our talent service line globally, and one thing led to the next. And here I am now leading what is called our people and organizational performance practice, focusing on transformations, talent strategies, change management. How do you behave in the context of mergers and acquisitions, and from tech and strategy to it's all about people.
Yeah, it's amazing. Maybe talk a bit about the process that you all went through to actually put the book together. Did you start from the standpoint of thinking about this concept that you articulate in the title, learning to lead from the inside out? I love that phraseology because I think it summarizes so beautifully what leadership really is all about. But maybe talk us through how you came about the approach that you all took in the book.
So it's a few sources of inspiration, as you can imagine. One is for the last decade, we've been leading what we call the Bauer Forum. The Bauer Forum is a very intimate program where CEOs, 4 or 5 CEOs, no more, come to reflect on their biggest challenges. And what we realized very early on is that the challenges that they're actually very quickly narrow in on are not what market should I play in or how do I improve my profitability, but who are my stakeholders? How do I make confident decisions? How do I navigate situations that I didn't expect? Do I really belong? And so we realize, okay, there's something different here. The gift that we can give to the world is not what you need to do, but actually who you need to be. So that was one thing. The other thing was the work that we're doing with organizations when we realized, as I shared earlier, that unless you work on the heart as well as the brain and the muscle, it's just not going to happen. And so we, in a lot of the work that we do, we have to weave in some reflections on leadership, on building capabilities. And the last thing is just what's happening around us, right? The world is asking for a sense of belonging, for purpose. People are trying to navigate their own tensions, and all that came together into what started as a series of stories from the Bauer Forum that then came into this frame of thinking of, I need to actually take that indulgent time to think about myself, because unless I tune in that engine and tool that is me, I cannot credibly lead others, credibly or effectively.
Yeah. Is there one thing that you find with maybe, general consistency that leaders who are struggling are experiencing, or some behavior or habit perhaps that they do or don't engage in that maybe makes a big difference that you sort of see with consistency?
I think the biggest thing is that, of course, there is a reason why they're very senior, successful leaders at the moment. And inevitably, they lean on the patterns and the habits that they've come up with, whether it is knowledge that they've built, whether it is experience that they've acquired over the course of their career. And so coming in, knowing the answers, feeling that they're expected to tell people what to do is a very, very familiar pattern that we're seeing with very, very senior leaders. And learning how to not lose, of course, your knowledge, your expertise, your ability to discern issues and identify what the right questions are. But at the same time, be open to learning, be open to listening to others, what we call humility in the first chapter, and understanding that you don't have all the answers. You have a unique viewpoint in seeing the pattern, in connecting the dots, in bringing your own experiences over the years, but you don't necessarily have all the answers. That is a very important one. And relinquishing that, I find it liberating, but if your entire life was based on the fact that you are the biggest expert in something or the quickest thinker in the room, at some point it begins to limit you.
How much do you think that tendency is driven by both fear and maybe loss of control, which are kind of the same thing?
We see it with leaders where when they're uncomfortable, when they are worried that maybe they don't belong where they are right now, there are two tendencies. One is to go one up, which is exactly what we were talking about. The other one is actually go one down, to try to drive consensus, to ask too many people, to bring them together. But that is definitely one of the patterns that is very familiar. The more nervous you get, the more stressed you get, the more you try to just get to the answer and show that you are that person that can lead the way through setting the direction that they understand better than others.
Yeah. What you're describing too, you talk about in the book a number of contradictory concepts that I think are really important for us to get our heads around. I mean, they make sense when you read it or when you say it, but they are indeed contradictory. Maybe talk us through some of the others that really are contradictions that you found and that you talk about in the book.
So we talked about confidence versus humility. One of my other favorites is professionalism versus authenticity. Can you show up as a human being, or do you always need to be that well put together individual that does not need to show their own fragility? Because God forbid, if you're fragile, how can you lead others? And that is one that is very difficult. And I had conversation with very senior leaders and women as well, who say, I am so worried to come across as not professional that I'm not bringing my full self into the conversation. That said, it is very difficult for people to follow us if they're not sensing that energy and passion and who you are as a human being. And admitting that sometimes we struggle is part of bringing other people along. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think this is exciting and we can do it together.
Yeah, so interesting. And I would think that the women that you talk to probably also worry about appearing to be weak.
Of course.
Right.
And not only women, by the way. One of the examples in the book, the leader of, he was in Mazda at the time, went to Japan and realized that all the frames of reference that he knew are different. And he didn't understand, why is it taking so long to make a decision? And then, of course, he learned that you need to actually put all the pieces in place, and then together you make a decision when it's already made. Do I belong in a culture that is different? So it is very common in women, but it is also common in Fisher, for example, who was in managing the Cincinnati hospital, was not a doctor. Do I have the credibility to lead a hospital when I'm not a doctor? So that shows up in many places and in many different ways. And in these situations, the tendency to lean on professionalism rather than admit that you don't necessarily have what it takes from a professional standpoint, but hey, I am here because I bring other things to the table. That is not an easy one to navigate.
One of the concepts in the book, which I think is so important from a leadership standpoint, but that, at least in my view, seems to have lost some favor. And maybe it's just sort of the complexity of the world that we're living in, but it's this notion of servant leadership and getting that balance between ego and what you're doing for you versus what you're doing for the organization or for sort of the broader good of the world. Let's talk a little bit about that concept of servant leadership and how you guys think about that. Talk about it in the book.
The first thing is that assuming that you're aspiring to lead a large organization of any sort, believing that as an individual you can do it all is, I would say, naive. There's no way that one person can get thousands and thousands of people in a certain direction, and therefore empowering others, engaging them, giving them the tools to be able to deliver is super, super important. And when we look at organizations and what keeps people excited in them, what we find is that your experience with your direct manager or leader, and it goes all the way up, is the one that will determine your desire to stay. And the only way that you excite people, particularly the younger generations, is if they understand, not in a bad way, but what's in it for them. What is it they're developing? What is it that they're learning? And your role as a leader is no longer to have the answer, but actually to help them find the skills, the tools, and the path forward. A little bit like our children, right? At some point, I learned that I cannot always be there to tell them what to do. So I might as well teach them what are the right values, what are the ways to think about things, and therefore make their decisions. So it's a little bit that same logic, and that's why servant leadership is so important. It feels maybe selfless, but in a way, it's very selfish.
Interesting.
I am a servant leader. If I build your capabilities, you can do so much more. So many people can do so much more. It is easier for me to move us all to the objective that we want to be. And therefore, quite often when we talk to public sector leaders, for example, and we think, okay, they're the ones motivated by doing something for society, they're saying, no, what are you talking about? I'm doing this for me because I am fulfilled and happy when I see that is happening in society. So
such an interesting way to kind of flip that on its head. I love that. The book includes a series of really great stories to illustrate these different concepts. And you also have included some incredible exercises that folks can go through to actually kind of take themselves through this process as well. Maybe talk about some of your favorites from the book.
One of my personal biggest favorites is understanding your own triggers. And then I will talk about how do you take it to a team. When you recognize what are those things that trigger you, and inevitably when you're triggered, you're not your best self, you're suddenly in a competitive mode, in a mode of scarcity, in lack of creativity. You know how to sense those things are happening. I get red. I try to speak much faster. I am impatient with other people. You recognize those signals and you know, okay, if I am that way, that means that I am not in my creative self right now. Recognizing that and then knowing how to get yourself out of that situation is super helpful. And it is not only powerful as an individual. One of my favorite exercises with management teams is to actually sit together, and it requires mutual trust and openness, and ask each other, tell each other what my trigger is, how do I know that I'm triggered, and what is required to take me out of that state. And once you share that and you have this language, I've seen teams actually start joking about it. They recognize when they slid right back into their old ways, but now they had a language to talk about it. They also knew how to be more considerate of one another. And suddenly it allowed them to put words around situations that otherwise would have just gotten them into this much less productive conversation. So that is one of my favorites. Another one from Bancel, who led Moderna, and I keep coming back to that question, when he asked his head of manufacturing, not is it possible, but what is it that you need from me to manufacture a gazillion vaccines in 0 time? So I try to adopt that question as well, to say, of course, if I will ask everybody if something huge is possible, then I will get all the risks and all the reasons why it can be done. But if we say, what is it that you need from me to make it happen? The conversation is very different. So these are 2 of the tips and tricks that I love. They sleep well, eat well, all those things that leaders tend to forget.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Getting that normal balance in life, right? There's a real brilliance to something that is at its core very simple, right? Having balance in your life. I know that reflection and taking a step back and making the time for that is a big priority. I've heard you talk about that in other interviews. I'd love for you to talk about your personal process and also how that sort of came to play in the book and how you saw that as one of these leadership qualities as well.
So as I mentioned, I came from a very different start of being very analytical, very content oriented, very questions focused, and thinking that I need to have all the answers because that's what a consultant does. And at some point, I realized that actually my role is not to give all the answers, but rather to guide teams through how they get to the best answer and actually work with other people to figure out what is their thinking process and how they get there. I literally had to learn how to be quiet, be silent, the power of silence. And then through a specific journey with a client where they asked us to help them facilitate a process where they think about their purpose, their organizational purpose, one of my colleagues started talking about centered leadership. And when he spoke of centered leadership, you could hear a pin drop in the room. And that was a very loud management team where everybody would speak over each other. And I was like, wait, what was that? What did you just talk about? I need to learn that. And that put me on a journey. He introduced me to Joanna Barsh, who's at the time developed centered leadership.
Yes.
She's invited me to a program with clients. Actually, I was the only McKinsey partner in that program. It was a 2-day program. I loved it. I said, I felt I only scratched the face of the surface. She said, okay, if you love that. Joanne Lavoie said, come into our master's leaders program. And one thing led to the next, and this is where I am right now. To me, the biggest learning comes from yoga. I try to practice it a lot. I'm not amazing at it, but I enjoy the learning and I enjoy the quiet and being at a very different place with very different people at a very different pace. So that is one of the things that I do for me as part of my attempts to step back and think differently and hear different perspectives in life.
I got goosebumps as you're talking about Joanna Barsh because her book, or the book that she wrote under the McKinsey framework, essentially called Centered Leadership, and before that, How Remarkable Women Lead, they were really life-changing for me in many respects because I was not making the connection between Joanna and you. I did not know about that connection, but I have heard her speak many times and have been sort of in contact with her. So I think that's such an interesting connection point. It really is a powerful book. I'm going to put that in the show notes as well because it's so thoughtful. And I feel like really timeless, even though that book probably came out, I don't know, 15 years ago, probably at this point.
At least, because I was in the New York office at the time and I was one of the guinea pigs as she was starting to play around with the program, which is probably how I started. Yeah.
Well, and that sort of begs the question too, because that book was largely focused, I mean, really directly focused on women, how women lead, and this particular methodology that she developed for women's leadership development. So I'm curious what you found in your research and the work on this particular book, The Journey of Leadership, How CEOs Learn to Lead from the Inside Out, and any particular differences that you saw between the male and female leaders.
I think that, by the way, Joanna admits, of course, that she started with women, but as she continued, she said, but actually that applies to men as well. So also her approach was then broadened. Her interview base, if you remember all her videos, started including men as well. And so I think that everything she said for women applies to men as well. Our fact base was mostly men. We had women as well, of course, in our Bauer forums and in our stories in the book, but it's mostly men. And what was amazing to me is actually, the need to feel that you belong, the courage to actually admit that you don't have all the answers, the vulnerability to show up as human, all that applied to both. And it's really more contextual than women or men. Of course, when there's fewer of us in the senior ranks, then more of us can feel like we don't belong. Maybe there's the imposter syndrome, but you see that in men as well. So actually, if there's anything, and I grew up with two brothers, I learned math and physics. I studied engineering as my undergrad. So most of my life was in a more of a male environment. And I actually think it's not so much a man or a woman, but a context issue, which Joanna herself would attest to.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
There's no question that your experience as a human being growing through life and as a leader make a massive impression on who you are as a leader. So if you grew up in an engineering environment and the defining factor was how skilled you are, how elegant is your code, and how much you know, of course that becomes your superpower until you realize that you achieved such a senior level that that is no longer sufficient. People at large, people are people, and those traits that we talk about in the book would serve you wherever you might be. And that shift from how you're used to leading to unlearn how to manage and relearn how to be human, it applies to all.
Yeah. When you think about what you hope success will look like for this book, do you have a sense of what you hope the book will do?
I hope that more people will embrace human leadership. I think, technology is now all around us, and some say it will take away from human leadership. I actually think that it will augment human leadership because those human traits are going to be more important rather than less. The context, the heart, the ability to ask the right questions, bringing that together and translating that to people, exciting people, all that will be even more important. So if we, legitimize the fact that us as leaders need to take time to reflect and perfect ourselves, not perfect from perfections, but keep learning. And if we legitimize these traits as just as important as the other ones, and therefore the world benefits from more human leaders, I think we will have a better chance of delivering all those amazing purposes that organizations have, like building the developers of tomorrow, or nourishing a better world, or choose your organization and their purpose.
Do you think, even though, granted, the advice and the perspective in this book doesn't just apply to CEOs, as you talked about at the beginning of the conversation, do you think that there will be a focus maybe by political leaders, for example, to take the advice in this book to heart, perhaps? Wouldn't that be really nice around the world to have more of a focus on these types of skills?
I think every leader, wherever they are, so it applies broadly, and that would be tremendous, right? More human leadership in the world, wherever it is, would be a gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that I've not asked you about that you think is really important for people to know about the book?
Well, I think the important thing for me is that never-ending learning journey. And again, why I love yoga, because it's never ending. There's always more to learn. There's always more to do. And practice is the best way to get there. The courage to try things, and the willingness to actually sometimes fail. To me, that journey is super important. And I think that when people think of learning, it doesn't have to be learning of another content field. It could be something completely different. It could be riding a bike if you don't know how to ride a bike. Whatever that might be, I think that really gives leaders a different perspective. The humility of being a beginner is super important.
Yeah, that whole concept of lifelong learning, right? That really is a secret to vitality. It's a secret to leadership. It's a secret to, happiness in life, essentially. Dana, this has been so wonderful. I wish you great success on the book. I really loved it. As I said, I'll include a link in the show notes where folks can purchase the book. Thank you again, and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Great to see you. Wow, that was truly an eye-opening conversation with Dana. The insights she shared about understanding our triggers, and the suggestion that she made about actually bringing your team together to talk about that so that you have a shared common language, I thought was really, really interesting. But also, and more broadly, just thinking about and cultivating human leadership has probably never been more important than it is right now. And that's true not just for folks who are in the C-suite, but for anyone who's navigating the complexities of work and life. And for me personally, I think that includes navigating family dynamics. I know I'm going to be reflecting on this conversation for a long time to come, and I hope that will be true for you as well. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please take a moment and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform and share your thoughts with me. I would be really grateful. Your feedback helps us continue to bring you inspiring conversations with incredible women. And also, don't forget to share this episode with a friend or a colleague who might also find it valuable. Again, I'd be really grateful. In the meantime, friend, thank you for tuning in to She Said, She Said. Until next week, you take care. And remember, She Said, She Said podcast is a weekly production of She Said, She Said Media.